Thank you for listening to the weekly sermon podcast from Piney Grove Baptist Church in Trenton, Georgia. Piney Grove is a church that is being renewed by faith that lives, love that works, and hope that endures. Our hope is that your heart will be renewed today. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming content.
Thank you for that song. Well, I'm excited to get to introduce Andrew Bunnell and his wife Sarah. We had a little bit of an unexpected event that took place this morning. I don't know Andrew and Sarah well. They know my older sister and my brother-in-law who pastors down in Tampa. They go way back. I didn't know that either. We were partnered with them at my old church, but I never got to talk to him when he came and went from Calvary. But I got to know him really by listening to a friend of mine's podcast who pastors up in Connecticut, and I heard his story, and so I reached out to him, and I'm like, I would love to have you come speak, because he has a unique story of what God has done through his life and through his family. But as we're out here talking, some of our friends from Kazakhstan walked by. I was like, this is unique, but we have some friends who have been coming for a few weeks from Kazakhstan. He's like, I spent like 10 years in Eastern Europe, and I know Russian. I'm like, what? No, I didn't know that. So they've been over there, him and Sarah, talking to our friends in Russian. How cool is that? And so I'm gonna let Andrew introduce his family and everything, but he asked me, he's like, hey, could we do something a little bit unique just because of our friends being here from Kazakhstan? I'm like, absolutely. So you come on up, man. I'll let him take it from here, but we're really glad to have him. We're excited to hear what God's going to speak, how God's going to speak through him today.
Thank you, Pastor. Well, it is good to be, I would say, in Georgia, but I live in Georgia, but I had to drive through Tennessee to get back to Georgia today, so it's good to be here with you. It's been a little while since I've been in the Chattanooga area. Have a lot of great memories here, and it was a beautiful drive up in the fall colors this morning. So it's great to be here. I'm currently serving as the president of Biblical Ministries Worldwide. We're a global mission organization that stands for one thing: healthy churches everywhere. And what that means is we work in 58 countries with over 500 people around the world to see three things happen: lost people saved, baptized, and raised up as disciples who make disciples of Jesus Christ; to see strong, healthy churches send missionaries to other places; and to provoke gospel-preaching churches in the United States to recapture their heart for missions. We spent about 20 years overseas, and when I first started on deputation in 1999, to where we've come as a church today in the United States, there's been a major drop-off in the number of young people, especially who are going out to missions. And on the one hand, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I don't believe it's all about numbers. If we saw those same young people going into God-called service in other areas, but we're not necessarily seeing that either. And so, completely unexpectedly, after about 10 years in Russia and Eastern Europe and about 10 years in London, England, we got a call one day and asked if we would consider going to Georgia. And I have a Georgia grandmother who my Texas grandfather dragged to Texas in the 40s, and she never quit being a Bulldogs fan, but I never imagined living in Atlanta area. And so that's just another mission field for us now. And that's where we are. But got back about 2 months before the pandemic broke out, and now here we are. I am very glad to be here with you today to share some stories, to talk about what missions is and really how it applies to your life and the life of this church. That's what we're going to do today. And we're going to be in John chapter 4. Just a moment, though, I'd like to introduce my family. My wife, Sarah, is here today. Sarah, if you'd stand. And then Joey, our oldest, is 17, and Jackson is 14. Thank you all. And we have worked together for many years in some really scary places. I say missions is a lot like this, as my military friends and colleagues and family members would say. It in some ways, people don't realize missions is the same. You have to go through the same rituals of life you do over here. You have to, you have to eat dinner. You have to go to the bank. Our church in London, we were trying to change over the bank accounts. It took 27 trips to the bank to get the signatories changed on the bank card. You're talking about trying to find contractors. Those things happen. So sometimes people romanticize missions and don't realize once you've gone through all the language learning or the cross-cultural adaptation, you haven't even gotten started yet. That's just the challenge, just to climb to the mountain. And then they say, well, now you got to keep climbing, because then you actually have to do something. So it's a lot like this. It's long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of extreme excitement. Isn't that what military guys say? Missions is a lot like that too. We're going to tell you one of those exciting stories, and a story today that goes back over many years. Before I do, in September, I was with a dear friend who I first met in 2007 with my then director, mentor, and still very, very dear friend, Brant and Maylu Holiday, who the Scriptures know very well, and it's great to see you all, by the way. I think I last saw you in a field conference quite a few years back. It's good to see you here today. And we were in Tbilisi, Georgia in 2007. And I got connected, and we were in a train, and then we spent about 24 hours on a train in the middle of Georgia, Gruzia, and we're going almost to the Turkish border, and then we went on this crazy long, really scary drive, and then hike, and then they got to a mountain pass, and we were in a Turkish village, which was in Georgia, completely Islamic. The head of the village was a polygamist, and on the mountain, there was a cross etched into the mountain. And they said, you see that cross? That's been there for hundreds of years, because this used to be a Christian village, and when the Muslims came in and invaded it, these rivers that you're looking at ran red with the blood of Christians. Welcome to the village. So that friend of mine, who is about my age and led Brant and me into that very interesting place, which was a wonderful experience, and God did some great things there. But we've worked together since then for many years now. One of the most extraordinary moments was getting 40,000 Bibles into the capital of Iran, which was one of the wildest things we ever did. He went, I didn't. So my friend's name is George. So I was with George, and my wife was there too. We were there in September. Since the war broke out, Sarah's been in Ukraine 4 times. We first went to that part of the world in the early 90s as young people and went on mission trips over there, and then lived and worked in Eastern Europe for about 10 years and never quit working there. We just rebased in London, and we're doing church revitalization in London as well. When the war broke out, we had an opportunity to do some amazing gospel ministry. But this was very special. In September, we were in Odessa and got to within 800 meters of the Russian front. So close we heard the artillery shells. That was not what we planned to do. We thought we were going to be a few kilometers from the front, and we were going to be in a church there and share the gospel, give food, give aid, give Bibles, and it was a wonderful experience. And then our brothers, we had driven 3 hours from Odessa to the city of Kherson, and as we got back into the car after this visit to this church, and I can't explain, I just don't have enough time to share all the stories, but as I walked into this church, you could see the walls had been strafed by bullets, and the building across the street had exploded, and they told us, there had been mass murder, mass rape in this city for 6 months under Russian occupation, and they absolutely targeted evangelical Christians in the town. And wherever the Russians go, they do that because they consider that to be a Western religion imported, and part of the goals they have is re-Russification. So anything they think that wasn't raised up in Russia should be eradicated from the earth. It's very, very dark and sinister. And And so we're in this church with bullet holes on the walls. And just had an incredible service. And then we think we're going back to Odessa, and believe me, we're ready to go back because we know we're not far from the lines. As we get in the car, we drive off another way. And they said, a few minutes, I'm thinking, we're just going a new road home. And then I realized we're not going home. Where are we going? I asked. They said, well, we have to make one more stop. The ladies in the church have baked a bunch of meat pies, and we're going to drop them off with some soldiers. I said, that's good, okay. Have you ever been in a journey and your sense of direction tells you something's just a little off? I felt water. I just sensed we were close to water. But there's these buildings, and I'm thinking, I felt like there's some water close by. Wasn't using my geolocator or any of that. We pulled into the little base, and the soldiers came out. We gave them the meat pies. We had this moment, and then I asked, I said, how close are we to the Dnieper River? You see, the Dnieper is the front. On this side of the Dnieper is the Ukrainians. On the other side is the Russians. Well, do you see that building right there? Yes. Well, the river's on the other side. I said, so my sense of direction was accurate. We're very close. And then I heard this noise, thump, like that. And I said, is that what I think it is? And I was saying it in Russian because I had some brothers from the States and I didn't want to let them know what was going on. And my dear Ukrainian brother said back to me, he said, да, конечно, это русская артиллерия. Just like that. And so I think, I looked at my friend from the States and I said, that means, and he cut me off. He said, Ruskaya artilleria translates in any language. I said, so Russian artillery. I said, I think it's about time to go, don't you? We did. That was Saturday. Saturday night, we got to our hotel, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, we had an alarm go off, and we had to go to the air raid shelter in the city of Odessa. Rockets flew over the city that night. After about an hour, there was an all clear, and then we had the alarms go off about 20 minutes later back in our room, and then we ended up spending from 3:30 to 6:30 in the morning in the air raid shelter as rockets flew over the city. We got to church in the morning. This church at the outbreak of the war had dropped to about 70 people. They'd gone from 4 pastors to 1. Only the senior pastor had stayed. A big, strong Baptist church in Odessa. They had just built a beautiful new building and property. We were there in September. The war had broken out in February of last year. Today, that church is almost 500 people. 5 pastors on staff. And I've never seen anything like it. I was in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, other places in the early, mid-90s as a teenage boy, preacher's kid. And I had never seen this combination of spiritual and physical hunger. People didn't have enough food. It was a terrible time. Terrible time. Inflation was like 1,000,000 to 1. 1,000,000 to 1. And I saw that again. And I know this stuff, what pains me most about after 20 years overseas being back in the States is we've decided to make everything political. Everything. And I'm not going to do that today. I'm just going to talk about lost people who need Jesus. What I saw was once again that same combination of spiritual and physical hunger. We couldn't give out enough Bibles and food. The difference now is the churches that I went to in 1992, 93, 94, 95 had pastors that had been in prison 2 years before, the year before. They were small churches. They were weak churches. They were just trying to come out of those times. 30 years later, churches with seminary training, outreach programs, missionaries being sent. They don't need us to go do anything for them. They just need our prayer and support to help them do what they're already doing. The church is on the front lines. After a night spent in the air raid shelter, I was on tap to preach the next day. It's not an easy thing to spend a night in an air raid shelter with rockets flying over and then get your sermon ready to go. That was a first. But preach I did. Got to church, and a deacon was talking to me on the front of the church porch, and he showed me a video. He said, "You know, we had rockets last night." I said, "Yes, I know. We all know." And they flew over. Thankfully, they didn't land. They were going somewhere else. So then he took his phone out, his iPhone, and he showed me the picture, and this guy, these are the kind of people in the church over there. This is how you know they're Baptist. He was out in his garden filming the rockets flying over. He said, "You know, the first month of the war, we went in the shelters too, and then we got a bit bored, so now we just go out and we'll look at them." So, it's a whole nother level. And one thing I was able to do that day was sing. And I sang a song that meant a lot to our group, and I believe it meant a lot to the church. When I walked into the service today, as your pastor said, I was able to meet some dear friends from part of the world where I've spent much of my life, and a story that continues on. So today, in honor of our brothers and sisters in Christ all across the world and those who are suffering in so many ways, I'm going to sing about a God that is great, and a God that connects us across cultures and lines and languages and people, and a God that is awesome and worthy of our wonder. So I'm going to ask Sarah if she'll come and play, and I'll sing. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Великий Бог, когда нам смотрю я на все, что ты создал рукой Творца, на всех существ, кого свой свет даруя, питаешь ты с любовью Отца. Тогда поет мой дух, Господь, тебе, как ты велик, как ты велик. Тогда поет мой дух, Господь, тебе, как ты велик, как ты велик. When Christ shall come with shout of acclamation and take me home, what joy shall fill my heart. Then shall I bow in humble adoration and there proclaim, my God, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Amen. All right. John chapter 4. Das благословит Господь для вас. It's an emotional thing when you see memories crossing in so many ways, and I think that's a little bit what heaven is going to be like. When people and moments and stories that God has written in your life come together at one moment and one time. The worst part about being a missionary is constantly saying goodbye and having people say goodbye to you. One of the least understood parts of being a missionary is not the missionary going on the airplane or used to be a ship to some other part of the world. That's hard enough. It's the grandparents who say goodbye to their grandchildren as they put them on that airplane. Because people remember the missionary, they don't remember the ones who sent them. Today's an interesting day to have all these moments come together. Your pastor, he's a missionary kid. My kids are missionary kids. Seeing people from our part of the world where we first served, people that we served in the same place in the UK as well. And all of these pieces and moments come together. And I think that's why we want people to be in heaven. Because as, I don't remember who, I think it was John Rice, but I know he had a lot to do with it. I remember hearing it. We'll never say goodbye in glory in the morning over yonder. Remember that one? Something in that. John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman. This sermon is called Someone is Coming to the Well. In the very first verse, Jesus has a problem. Jesus has a problem. And it's interesting because John 3:36 is one of the great verses in the Bible. He that believeth on the Son hath everlasting life. He that believeth not the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abideth on him. And of course, 1 John tells us that the way we know is that we love one another and God's love is in our hearts. And we identify that together. He that has the Son has life. He that does not have the Son of God does not have life. 1 John 5 correlates very well with John 3, right? So a powerful promise, and that's one that's for you today, too. But then in John 4, something happens. The Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John. Of course, Jesus doesn't baptize, it's just the disciples, we see that. So he has to leave Judea and go to Galilee. Why? That's a very, very important statement. John chapter 4, verse 1 tells us that as bad a threat as John the Baptist was, Jesus is a bigger threat. He's getting more than John. He's got to leave. He's got to go. If you've ever been to the Holy Land, you've ever been to Israel, and mine doesn't need prayer right now, you know there is a journey that goes from this Judea, where Jerusalem is in this part of the country, he has to go to the north country, where the Sea of Galilee is. So he's going from the south to the north. I'm sorry, I'm from the south, and there's so many things we can say with that. I married a northern girl. I don't know. It's another whole complicating factor. That works in Georgia. Doesn't work everywhere. He left Judea and going into Galilee. As he's going through this place, he has to go through Samaria. Now, Samaria is a weird place, and it's on the way between Judea and Galilee. You've got to go through. It's still, if you take a tour, it's still one of the shorter ways to go. If you go through the country, you can take a bus right through what is still Samaria today. I've done it. The problem is, Jews and Samaritans don't get along. So we have a situation here where to go to the place that he's trying to go, he has to stop off and he has to be with people that don't like Jews and who Jews also don't like. 2,000 years later, there's still very similar problems over there. So here he goes. He comes to the city called Sychar. Now, we're going to jump into verse 6 and 7. Jesus sitting there by what is reputed to be Jacob's well, and it's about the 6th hour of the day. So this is later in the day on the Jewish timeline. Verse 7, there comes a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus says to her, "Give me to drink. Give me to drink." In that moment, Jesus did something that was very, very evangelistic. Very evangelistic. There are three principles of evangelism. If you want to reach people that don't know Jesus for Jesus, there are three things you have to do. First, you have to go somewhere where people don't know Jesus. That's the first thing. Then, you've got to talk to them. And then third, they have to listen. Those are the three components of evangelism. People talk to me about methods. How do you evangelize? How do you reach people? It all comes down to those three things. You've got to go where there are people who don't know Jesus. Well, Jesus went where people didn't know Jesus. So he's sitting by the well. And when he asks this question, he does something amazing. He speaks to a woman. He speaks to a woman. In that time, women were treated very similar to property. Marriages were often arranged. There was often money involved. They did not have the status and privileges or the access. And you could make a strong case that women were treated as less than men, probably did not get equal pay for equal work, certainly did not have things like voting rights, but were very much seen on the margins of society. I'm so glad we fixed all those problems today. We don't have any trouble with that. Sorry, living in England, my natural sarcasm came out for 10 years, so I'm glad we've solved all the problems with women's rights in America. I'm sure no woman in the room has ever felt marginalized in a group of men before. Jesus was very good at breaking those boundaries. Very, very good. And he does a very simple thing. He acknowledges the image of God, the imago Dei, the equality in her, by doing something very simple. A human basic request. Not exploitative, not abusive, not coercive, not cruel, just very simple. May I have a drink? And she's shocked. And how do we know she's shocked? Because she says she is. Verse 9. The woman of Samaria said to him, how is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. Not just a Samaritan, but a woman of Samaria. A very low-ranking social member of the caste system. Again, being from the South, we have a little bit of a class system here. Not as bad as England, but it's not far off. Who you are, who your family is, who you know, where you come from, what your tribe is, who you belong to. You see, we as human beings are really good at dividing that way. What team you pull for on Saturdays matters, doesn't it? Again, that joke doesn't work everywhere, but it works here. We're not going to name names today. I'm just going to fly right on by it, but you know what you know. Those things create fights. They create divides. They get people in wars with each other and arguments with each other. And you say, well, that's just how we are. No, that's how people are. That's how people are. And the very difficult thing about missions is that to be a missionary, you have to get out of all that stuff. You even have to let go of the food you love. That's really hard to do. Do you know how many rituals are built around food? What's really interesting here in this text is food's here too. While Jesus is talking to this woman, the disciples have gone into the city to get food. Everything, especially if you're a Baptist, revolves around food. When I was in the city of Kherson with the Russian artillery just on the other side of the river over there, what were we doing? We were giving them special food that they liked. I mean, they had food, but we were giving them treats, meat pies, home-baked. It's all about these things. And then somehow we have to let go of those routines and those loves because there's something else. At the end of the chapter, or the end of the story, in verse 32, Jesus says to the disciples, I have meat to eat that you know not of. I have a different source of food. Something else is driving me than just the regular things we do. So let me tell you what it looks like in practice. Jesus broke a big barrier. He shattered a barrier. He spoke to a Samaritan. Here's what it looked like for us. When we got to Russia, very early 2000s, we had had a whirlwind deputation, raised our support, gotten over there. Way too young. But there were some good things about that. We got to Russia. We were the junior members of a team over there. We were 3 missionaries. And a few months into our time there, we got into winter. Now, my wife's from Minnesota. I grew up in Texas. And family right across, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. And as cold as Minnesota was, it's not this cold. We had one of the coldest winters they had in a long time. There was a 5-week stretch where the daytime high was around 20 below zero. Warmest temperature in 5 weeks. December 26th, it was somewhere around that. 2002. And the weird thing is, you'd say, well, that's the day after Christmas. Well, it was, but in Russia, it wasn't celebrated as Christmas because they do Orthodox Christmas, and that's in January. So we had our own Christmas while everybody went to work. Another weird thing about being a missionary. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning, and a bomb went off in our building. An actual one. It felt like somebody had picked up our building and slammed it back down on the ground. I jumped up, looked out the window, and I saw broken glass, broken windows on the other side of the street, and smoke pouring out. And they would have these babushkas. These are grandmothers, old women, with brooms made of wood twigs, and they still clean the streets this way. And you could hear this noise. Every morning, the women would be sweeping the sidewalks. And I looked out the window, and there was the babushka, dropped her broom on the ground, staring up open mouthed as smoke is pouring out of our building. And I ran downstairs into the courtyard with a coat, looked, and the backside of our building was all blown out. One apartment had collapsed into another, and fires, flames, and smoke coming out the backside. We kept a go bag because our phones were tapped, we were followed, we always knew there was a chance we'd have 24 hours notice and we'd have to leave the country. And we grabbed that bag, grabbed our coats, bundled up and ran downstairs, and we waited. After 45 minutes or so, the fire crew and the police showed up, and after they'd had a cigarette, decided to get to work. Seriously. We watched them carry out 2 dead bodies wrapped in sheets, and it was welcome to Russia. That night on the evening news, they told us we could go back in our building. They decided it was structurally safe. We don't know why, but we did. We didn't have a choice. It was 20 below zero. That night on the evening news, it was announced that between the minute of 6 a.m. and 6:02 or 6:03 a.m., there was sadly 3 apartments in St. Petersburg, Russia, that had had gas explosions. The one interesting thing about all 3 of those apartments is that they were occupied by known opposition to Vladimir Putin, and they were also suspected ties to the mafia. This was 2002, right as we say Putin was taking over the country. So what's happened in the last few years is no surprise to us. We got to see it in real time when it was happening in Russia. A few months after that, I say all that just to give you the sense, the psychological sense of being there. I got a call about 10 o'clock at night from a woman who had an American voice, American accent. She called me from Moscow. She was a single woman missionary, and it was around 10 o'clock at night. She called me. She said, "Are you Andrew?" I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "Look, someone gave me your number, and we have some people from Afghanistan that we've been working with in Moscow. They fled from the Taliban, the first Taliban, the 9/11 Twin Towers Al-Qaeda Taliban, 25 years ago. And the Red Cross has moved them with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR. They've moved several thousand of them to Moscow, and they're living in temporary quarters, and the Red Cross is moving a group of them to St. Petersburg. Here's the thing. We've given Bibles, and we've been working and ministering and giving aid to several families, and now we're going to lose touch with them, and we're trying to get some missionaries who will help." Okay, your first thought might be, well, you're missionary, preacher's kids. Well, of course, you would say yes. But here's the thing. We'd had a bomb go off in our building. Our phones had been tapped. We'd been followed. We were already living in Russia. It was scary in its own way, and certainly intense if it wasn't scary. And 9/11 had just been a year or so before. And they were Muslims. Afghanistan, Taliban. Okay, just think about how your brain's working. It's 10 o'clock at night. I don't even know who this woman is. What does this mean? What am I supposed to do with this? I'm here to reach Russians. We're working with the Russian Baptist Church. They're planting a church. What? And they're Muslim? and they're not even Christians. And we have a war in Afghanistan and a war in Iraq. And so you know what you do, right? In a situation like that? You think of nice Christian words that you can say to get yourself off the hook. That's what you do. Well, I'll certainly be in prayer for them. Well, let me think of a way I could possibly find someone who could help. And then it sounded like she teared up on the phone, which makes it worse. And she said these words I'll never forget. She said, please. She said, I'm just asking you to meet with them one time. She knew if I met with them one time, I'd keep meeting. She said, I've called 6 missionaries tonight, and you're the 7th I've called. And they just keep giving me somebody else's number. And I knew what I had to do then. Okay, reluctantly, against my better judgment, I will meet with them. And this just tells you the mindset of how silly we can be. Missionaries are no better than anybody else. I got this thought, well, if I'm going to meet with these guys, I'm going to meet with them at McDonald's. There was a McDonald's in St. Petersburg. I don't know why I thought McDonald's would be safe, but I thought it's American. It's a zone of safety. I'll meet there in McDonald's. What I didn't think about was several months later when I sat down with them for the first time in McDonald's, they had never been in a McDonald's before, nor had they ever eaten an American cheeseburger. Certainly not a Big Mac, which I made the mistake of ordering. I thought, what do I get these guys? I just get 3 Big Macs. One for me and one for each of them. When you think about it, if you've never met a Big Mac in your life, it's a complicated piece of food. You've got 3 pieces of bread going on. You've got different pickles and cheese. They deconstructed the Big Mac, ladies and gentlemen. They broke them down into pieces and parts and then created little roll-ups, like wraps, like Middle Eastern wraps with the Big Mac. It was the last time we went to McDonald's. I learned my lesson. And I really got over myself that day. Like, well, that was silly. And from then on, we started meeting in their house or our house, having some pretty great Afghan food. What changed for me that day is I looked in their eyes and I saw the hunger for Jesus in their eyes. I saw the lostness. I saw the need, the hopelessness. Several months later, both of those men were baptized in a secret baptism. The water was cold. I'd gone the day before. It was a sauna that was like a health sauna, and we were trying to find a place we could have a secure baptism because if the rest of the community found out they were getting baptized, their lives would be in danger. So we had to find a secure place. We had our Russian church and some of the pastors and even the American folks from Moscow actually took the train up and came to the baptism. The guy said, oh, it'll be warm. We'll have all the heat turned on for you. He did not. It was freezing cold. And it was a deep pool because it was like a health plunge pool. And so I had one short guy, one tall guy, he was fine. One short guy, I had to literally brace him on my knee as we got him baptized, or else he couldn't stand in the water. Freezing cold. I could go on for hours to tell you the things that happened over the next 7 years. I don't have time. What I can tell you is this. One of those men was beaten. His son was badly beaten in an elevator. The other man was viciously stabbed on the street, all for the faith. He survived. His brother saved his life. Over the next 7 years, over 80 people from that community gave their life to Christ. Over 80. Then they began to be scattered around the world. Some of them were able to get to the States, some to the Netherlands, some to Canada. They were all refugees. And what happened was, if you got your name on a list that the Red Cross would give you, they would hand that list to the UN office, who would then give it to the embassies, and then the embassies would decide who would go. Here was the secret trick to getting your name high on the list was to give a $10,000 bag of cash to the local head of the Red Cross, the Russian chapter there in St. Petersburg. Thankfully, Senator John Cornyn's office from Texas intervened on the behalf of these dear Christian people, and he got them straight to the embassy and bypassed the whole system. It's amazing what a call from a senator can do. And a lot of prayer. The man who was stabbed, the short man that I had to brace on my knee, everybody left. They scattered. Many still very faithful. A few stayed in Russia and plugged into churches. That man, though, he decided to go back to Afghanistan. He went back in 2010 as an ordained Baptist pastor. His day job was a lawyer working for NATO and for the federal government of Afghanistan. He had a great cover. As he told me, he said, people treat me very well because my signature can put them in prison or get them out of prison. So, well, that's a really great way to be a secret church planter. No questions asked. He planted 3 churches, reached over 96 people, personally led 14 to Christ. And then in August of 2021, after 11 years serving in that country, I got a message on WhatsApp. The Taliban are hunting me. I've had to move 7 times. They're going to kill us. Can you get me out of here? For 20 years, I had worked overseas. Sarah and I had contacts in business and government and education and church. And we worked for 3 days around the clock to pull every string we could think of. We had a representative from Eastern Tennessee, from the U.S. House of Representatives, senators' offices, Department of State, Pentagon, people all over the world, British government people working on this. And after 3 days on a Saturday night, my dear friend from 20 years earlier, I had him up to the gate of the Kabul airport. We had a passcode. And this is a great story for Veterans Sunday. The passcode to give to the Marines on the gate, and this came right from D.C., was the word Geronimo. Imagine giving the word Geronimo to Afghan people. Geronimo, that makes a lot of sense to us. He's like, Geronimo. Yes, Geronimo. Say Geronimo, and they'll let you in. In the 30 minutes it took to get that message from D.C. to Afghanistan and to repeat it 17 times so they would understand what to say, there was a shift change. And the Marines on duty failed to tell the new group about this group that was outside the gate and the passcode. Then bullets started to fly, and they weren't getting in. They had to retreat into the shadows and stand behind a building. And for an hour, we had no idea. We had 22 people standing outside the gates of the Kabul airport, believers in Jesus Christ, church leaders, family members, a baby as young as 3 months, and an older person in their 70s. That's the group. We'd moved them through multiple Taliban checkpoints just to get them there, and now people were dying in the streets. It was an hour, and then I got a call from a man in London. He gave me a cell phone number. My dear friend from London, England, said, give this number to the senator's office, and we think it might help. Well, I'd been working 3 days around the clock with politicians, and it hadn't helped yet. So I took a long look at the number. I Googled the area code, and it was Connecticut. I called the number. He picked up, and I heard airplane engines. And I thought, well, that's good. And then a voice said, sir, hold on while I step away from these engines. How can I help you? I said, well, I'm Andrew Bunnell, president of Biblical Ministries Worldwide, and I'm trying to be very official, really trying to throw some names around. I've got some Christian people with British special forces that need to get... He cuts me off. No name dropping needed. He said, you mean those 22 people with the Brits? Christians, right? Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. I was expecting your call. Tell your friends to get off the street. It's dangerous out there. Me and my boys are going to get a little sleep, and then in a few hours we'll come get them out. What? That easy? I said, what do you need? Well, he said, I need a list of their names. He said, you need passports? No, don't need that. I said, I need 2 phone numbers in case one of them dies. He said, I need a location. I said, okay, how do I get you the location? Because I'm thinking security, right? He screams at me on the phone and uses some rather military type of language. And he says, sir, have you ever heard of Google Maps, sir? I said, well, yes, sir, I have. He says, well, then drop a pin, sir. I dropped a pin on Google Maps to a U.S. Special Forces guy, a pararescue jumper with the United States Air Force. The next day, we were in church about 11 o'clock on Sunday morning in the middle of a song, and I saw a message pop up on my WhatsApp and a recording, once again with airplane engines, and Pastor O'Reef's nephew saying into the phone, we are safe, we are alive, we are free. That was August of 2021. 2 Sundays ago, I stood on a church stage at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Newington, Connecticut, pastored by Carrie Schmidt, with Pastor O'Reef, our friend from London, the Special Forces operator who had grown up an hour away from that church, and several of other of our team. And we heard how God had delivered them. But Pastor O'Reef, here's what he's doing now. He's still reaching people, thousands of people from Iran, Afghanistan. He's in Syracuse, New York today, and he's doing it on Facebook. I could unpack this John 4 for hours and weeks. It's one of the great passages in all the Bible. But I'm going to jump over a bunch of verses and close with this last verse. When Jesus crossed over to the Samaritan, he was there to reach the Jews, the Gentiles, and the Samaritans. At the end of the passage, verse 39, after verse 28 and 29, where the woman has this amazing conversation with Jesus, and you need to read it on your own time, because he shares his life, the water of life, the joy of life, the truth of the Spirit and life. But what's the result? In verse 29, she says, come see a man which told me all things that ever I did. Is not this the Christ? Verse 30, they went out of the city and came unto him. And verse 39, many of the Samaritans of that city believed on him for the saying of the woman, which testified, he told me all that ever I did. An entire city of Samaritans came to know Jesus because he crossed a divide. We didn't know we were going to Russia and going to do all that we did. We didn't know we were going to meet Afghans. We didn't know there were going to be 12,000 Afghan Christians rescued in the months after that first call in August. We didn't know that tens of thousands of more would be reached, and we don't know where this story is going to go in 10 years. What I can tell you is this: if you will get your heart into missions and get in the flow of the love of God and what God is up to, he will write a story that if you said it was fiction, you'd be laughed out of the room. But because it's not fiction, all you can do is stand back and say, Veliki Bog, how great thou art. Let's pray.